In the unforgiving skies above Afghanistan, where the difference between life and death is measured in split seconds and the margin for error is zero, one name became legend. It wasn't the name of a decorated general or a seasoned SEAL commander. It was the call sign of a 26-year-old woman who transformed a flying tank into an instrument of precision warfare so devastating that even the most hardened special operations veterans would later admit they had never seen anything like it. They called her Storm, and when she climbed into the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, the battlefield itself seemed to hold its breath. This is the true story of how one female pilot redefined what was possible in the air, earned the respect of the most elite warriors on Earth, and proved that sometimes the most unexpected person can become the most extraordinary force of nature. The day a SEAL commander would later describe as, "The moment I understood what real air support looked like, began like any other combat mission." But by the time the dust settled, military aviation history had been rewritten, and Storm had earned a place in the brotherhood of warriors that few could ever hope to achieve. This is her story. Captain Sarah Storm Mitchell never intended to become a legend. Growing up in a small farming town in Kansas, she was the daughter of a crop duster pilot who spent more time in the air than on the ground. Her father, Jake Mitchell, flew an old Cessna 188 ag wagon that he'd bought second-hand and rebuilt from the ground up. Sarah would spend her summers riding along in the passenger seat, watching the endless fields of wheat and corn roll beneath them like a golden ocean. The first time she took the controls, she was 12 years old and barely tall enough to see over the instrument panel. Jake had been spraying a field of soybeans when he noticed Sarah's intense focus on every movement he made. Without warning, he placed her hands on the yoke and said, "Your airplane." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew that old crop duster with a natural grace that made her father's heart skip a beat. She didn't just control the aircraft, she seemed to communicate with it, understanding its needs and capabilities, as if they were extensions of her own body. By the time she graduated high school, Sarah had logged more flight hours than most commercial pilots twice her age. She could land their beat-up Cessna on a dirt strip in a crosswind that would make seasoned aviators think twice. She understood the relationship between power and weight, lift and drag, not just as academic concepts, but as living, breathing realities that she felt in her bones every time she took to the sky. The decision to join the Air Force came during her sophomore year at Kansas State University, where she was studying aerospace engineering. She had been watching the news coverage of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, seeing the footage of close air support missions where A-10 Warthogs would swoop down from the sky to provide life-saving fire support to troops on the ground. Something about the raw, purposeful nature of that mission called to her in a way that crop dusting in commercial aviation never could. Her parents were supportive but worried. Jake knew his daughter had the skills to be an exceptional pilot, but military aviation was a different world entirely. The physical demands, the mental pressure, and the reality of combat were things that no amount of civilian flying could truly prepare someone for. Sarah's mother, Linda, had spent years worrying about Jake's flying, and the thought of her daughter in a combat zone was almost too much to bear. But Sarah had made up her mind. She walked into the Air Force recruiting station in Manhattan, Kansas, on a cold February morning, and told the recruiter she wanted to fly fighters. The sergeant, a veteran of Desert Storm, looked at this young woman with her quiet confidence and steady gaze, and knew immediately that she wasn't just another college student looking for adventure. There was something in her eyes that spoke of serious purpose and unshakable determination. The path to becoming an Air Force pilot is one of the most demanding training programs in the military. It begins with Officer Candidate School, where future aviators learn leadership, military customs, and the basic skills needed to function as commissioned officers. For Sarah, this was her first real taste of military life, and she threw herself into it with the same focused intensity she had brought to flying. The physical training was brutal. Daily runs, obstacle courses, and strength training designed to push candidates to their absolute limits. Sarah had always been athletic, playing volleyball and running track in high school, but this was different. This was about building not just physical strength, but mental resilience, the ability to perform under extreme stress and fatigue. She excelled in academics, particularly in the technical subjects related to aviation and aerospace engineering. Her background in crop dusting had given her an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems and flight dynamics that many of her classmates lacked. While they struggled with concepts of thrust-to-weight ratios and aerodynamic efficiency, Sarah was already thinking 3 steps ahead, understanding how these principles would apply in real-world flying situations. But it was her performance in the leadership exercises that really set her apart. The Air Force doesn't just want skilled pilots, It wants officers who can lead and make critical decisions under pressure. Sarah had a natural ability to assess complex situations quickly and communicate her decisions clearly and confidently. Her instructors noted that she had an unusual combination of aggressive decision-making and careful risk assessment, traits that would serve her well in combat aviation. After graduating from Officer Candidate School, Sarah moved on to undergraduate pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. This is where aspiring Air Force pilots learn to fly military aircraft, starting with the T-6 Texan II trainer and progressing to more advanced aircraft as they prove their abilities. The T-6 was Sarah's first experience with a military aircraft, and the difference between it and her father's old crop duster was immediately apparent. Everything was more precise, more demanding, and required a level of discipline and attention to detail that civilian flying had only hinted at. The aircraft had ejection seats, advanced avionics, and performance capabilities that far exceeded anything she had flown before. Her first instructor pilot was Major Tom Harrison, a former F-16 pilot who had transitioned to training duties after completing his combat tours. Harrison had trained hundreds of student pilots over his career, and he had developed an eye for recognizing exceptional talent. From Sarah's very first flight, he knew he was working with someone special. She had this ability to think ahead of the aircraft, Harrison would later recall. Most student pilots are reactive, responding to what the airplane is doing. Sarah was predictive, anticipating what the aircraft was going to do, and preparing for it before it happened. That's a skill that usually takes years to develop, but she seemed to have it naturally. The training syllabus at Laughlin is designed to systematically build pilot skills through a series of increasingly complex missions. Students start with basic aircraft handling and navigation, then progress through formation flying, aerobatics, and instrument procedures. Each phase is designed to eliminate those who don't have what it takes to be military aviators. Sarah not only passed each phase, but consistently scored at the top of her class. Her formation flying was so precise that her instructors used her flights as examples for other students. During aerobatic training, she demonstrated a spatial awareness and G-tolerance that impressed even the most experienced instructors. When they moved into instrument flying, where pilots must navigate and fly using only cockpit instruments without outside visual references, Sarah's systematic approach and attention to detail made her a standout performer. But it was during the combat-related phases of training that Sarah truly began to shine. When they practiced low-level navigation, flying at high speed just a few hundred feet above the ground, Sarah showed an ability to read terrain and weather conditions that seemed almost intuitive. During air-to-air combat maneuvers, she displayed an aggressive tactical mindset combined with precise aircraft control that made her a formidable opponent in training fights. The most challenging part of pilot training is learning to think like a combat aviator while simultaneously mastering the technical skills of flying high-performance military aircraft. Many excellent civilian pilots struggle with this transition because combat flying requires a different mindset entirely. It's not enough to be able to control the aircraft. A combat pilot must be able to think tactically, assess threats, and make life-or-death decisions while flying at hundreds of miles per hour in hostile airspace. Sarah's background had prepared her for this better than she realized. Years of crop dusting had taught her to fly in challenging conditions, often at low altitude in turbulent air while managing complex flight patterns. She was comfortable with risk and had learned to make quick decisions based on incomplete information. These skills, combined with her natural tactical thinking ability, made the transition to military flying seem almost effortless. As training progressed, Sarah began to develop a reputation among her classmates and instructors. She was known for her calm professionalism under pressure, her willingness to help struggling classmates, and her relentless pursuit of perfection in everything she did. She wasn't the most outgoing person in her class, but she commanded respect through her competence and dedication. The culmination of pilot training is the assignment process, where students receive their aircraft assignments based on their performance, preferences, and the needs of the Air Force. The most coveted assignments go to fighter aircraft like the F-15, F-16, and F-22. Transport and cargo aircraft are generally considered less desirable, though they serve crucial roles in military operations. Sarah's dream was to fly the A-10 Thunderbolt II, known to its pilots as the Warthog. This aircraft was designed specifically for close air support, providing direct fire support to ground troops engaged in combat. It was built around a massive 30 mm GAU, 8 Avenger cannon, and was famous for its ability to absorb battle damage and keep flying. Many of her classmates thought she was crazy for wanting the A-10. It wasn't the fastest or most glamorous fighter aircraft, and it operated in the most dangerous part of the battlefield, flying low and slow, where enemy ground fire posed a constant threat. But Sarah understood something about the mission that appealed to her on a fundamental level. The A-10 wasn't about personal glory or air-to-air combat. It was about providing life-saving support to soldiers on the ground who desperately needed help. Her instructors weren't surprised by her choice. Throughout training, Sarah had consistently shown more interest in air-to-ground missions than air-to-air combat. She had a natural understanding of how to work with ground forces and seemed to genuinely care about the close air support mission. When assignment night arrived, Sarah was selected for A-10 training, and she couldn't have been happier. The celebration was subdued by the knowledge that A-10 training would be even more demanding than pilot training, and that completion of the program would likely mean deployment to a combat zone. By 2010, operations in Afghanistan were intensifying, and A-10 squadrons were in high demand to provide close air support to ground forces engaged in counterinsurgency operations. But Sarah was ready for whatever came next. She had found her calling in the cockpit of that old crop duster flying over Kansas wheat fields, and now she was about to take the next step toward becoming one of the most feared and respected close air support pilots in the United States Air Force. The girl who had learned to fly among the cornfields was about to become Storm, and the skies above Afghanistan would never be the same. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona is home to the 355th Wing and the heart of A-10 training for the United States Air Force. When Sarah arrived there in the summer of 2010, the desert heat was overwhelming. But the sight of dozens of A-10 Thunderbolt IIs lined up on the flight line made her forget about the temperature. These weren't the sleek, elegant fighters that most people think of when they imagine military aircraft. The A-10 was built for one purpose: to destroy enemy ground targets while absorbing tremendous amounts of battle damage. The aircraft looked like someone had built an airplane around a gun, which was essentially what had happened. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the centerpiece of the A-10's weapons system was so large that the aircraft's nose gear had to be offset to one side to make room for it. The twin engines were mounted high on the fuselage to reduce the risk of foreign object damage during operations from rough airfields, and the cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub designed to protect the pilot from ground fire. Sarah's first close look at an A-10 confirmed everything she had hoped about the aircraft. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something unmistakably purposeful about its design. Every line, every component, every system had been optimized for survivability and lethality in the close air support mission. This was an aircraft built by people who understood that sometimes the most important job in military aviation is helping the soldier on the ground who was outnumbered and outgunned. A-10 training begins with extensive ground school, where new pilots learn every system on the aircraft in exhaustive detail. Unlike multi-role fighters that are expected to perform many different missions, the A-10 is highly specialized, and its pilots need to understand exactly how to employ its unique capabilities. The weapon systems alone require weeks of study, covering everything from the massive GAU-8 cannon to precision-guided bombs and air-to-ground missiles. Sarah threw herself into the academic portion of training with the same intensity she had brought to every previous challenge. The technical manuals for the A-10 were thick enough to use as doorstops, but she read every page multiple times, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions during classroom sessions. Her instructors quickly recognized that she wasn't just memorizing procedures, she was developing a deep understanding of why systems worked the way they did, and how they could be employed most effectively in combat. The weapons systems training was particularly intensive. The GAIO-8 cannon fired depleted uranium shells at a rate of 4,200 rounds per minute, and understanding how to employ it effectively required mastering complex ballistics calculations and target engagement procedures. Sarah had to learn to think in terms of engagement angles, standoff distances, and collateral damage considerations while flying a high-performance aircraft in a combat environment. But weapons were only part of the equation. A-10 pilots also needed to master the art of close air support, which required developing an intimate understanding of ground warfare and learning to work as part of a combined arms team. This meant studying infantry tactics, understanding how ground units maneuvered and communicated, and learning to read the battlefield from the air in a way that would allow them to provide the most effective support possible. Sarah's background in crop dusting proved invaluable during this phase of training. She was already comfortable flying low and slow, reading terrain features, and operating in close proximity to ground activities. Many fighter pilots struggle with the transition to close air support because they are used to operating at high altitude and high speed. But Sarah felt at home in the low-altitude environment where the A-10 did its best work. When she finally strapped into an A-10 for her first flight, Sarah felt like she was coming home. The cockpit was cramped and utilitarian, packed with switches, displays, and controls needed to operate the aircraft's complex systems. But once she started the engines and began to taxi, everything felt natural and familiar. The A-10 responded to her inputs with the same honest, predictable behavior she remembered from her father's crop duster, just with about 10 times the power and capability. Her first instructor in the A-10 was Lieutenant Colonel Mike Gunner Davidson, a veteran of Desert Storm who had flown over 200 combat missions in the aircraft. Davidson had a reputation as one of the best close air support pilots in the Air Force, and he was known for pushing his students hard to prepare them for the realities of combat operations. The A-10 will do anything you ask it to do, Davidson told Sarah during their first flight briefing. The question is whether you're asking it to do the right things. In close air support, the decisions you make in the cockpit have direct consequences for the soldiers on the ground. They're counting on you to be perfect, every time. Sarah's first few flights in the A-10 were focused on basic aircraft handling and systems operations. She learned how the aircraft responded to control inputs, how to manage its unique engine and flight characteristics, and how to operate its complex avionics and weapons systems. The A-10 was heavier and more powerful than anything she had flown before, but it had a forgiving nature that made it relatively easy to fly safely. What impressed her instructors was how quickly she progressed beyond basic aircraft handling to tactical employment. Most students needed dozens of flights to develop the situational awareness and multitasking ability required for effective close air support operations, but Sarah seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how to integrate flying, navigation, communication, and weapons employment into a seamless whole. During low-altitude navigation training, Sarah demonstrated an almost uncanny ability to read terrain features and maintain precise navigation while flying at 500 feet above the ground at 300 miles per hour. She could identify landmarks, avoid obstacles, and stay on course while simultaneously managing radio communications and monitoring for simulated threats. Her instructors began using her flights as examples for other students who were struggling with the demanding multitasking requirements of low-level operations. The weapons training phase was where Sarah truly began to distinguish herself. Learning to employ the GAU-8 cannon effectively required developing an understanding of ballistics that went far beyond anything taught in basic pilot training. The cannon shells had a significant flight time and were affected by aircraft speed, altitude, and angle of attack in complex ways that required split-second calculations and precise aircraft control. Sarah approached weapons training with the same systematic methodology she had brought to every other aspect of her aviation career. She studied ballistics tables until she could recite engagement parameters from memory. She practiced gun tracking exercises on the simulator until her movements became automatic. When she finally flew her first live-fire training mission, she put 90% of her rounds on target, a performance that impressed even her crusty instructor. But accuracy with weapons was only part of what made an effective close-air support pilot. The real challenge was learning to integrate weapons employment with tactical decision-making in dynamic combat scenarios. This required developing the ability to assess threats, prioritize targets, and coordinate with ground forces while flying a high-performance aircraft in a hostile environment. The training scenarios became increasingly complex as the course progressed. Students would fly missions where they had to respond to simulated troops in contact situations, coordinate with multiple ground units, and engage targets while avoiding friendly forces and minimizing collateral damage. These exercises required split-second decision-making and the ability to adapt quickly to changing tactical situations. Sarah excelled in these complex scenarios because she had developed an unusual ability to think several steps ahead while maintaining perfect situational awareness. She could track multiple ground units, assess the tactical situation, plan her attack runs, and execute precise weapons deliveries, all while maintaining constant communication with ground controllers. Her instructors noted that she seemed to have a natural understanding of ground warfare that allowed her to anticipate what ground units needed before they asked for it. One particular training scenario became legendary among her classmates. The exercise involved responding to a simulated ambush of a convoy where friendly forces were pinned down by enemy fire from multiple positions. Students were required to arrive on scene, assess the tactical situation, coordinate with ground forces, and eliminate the threats without causing friendly fire incidents or excessive collateral damage. Most students approached this scenario methodically, spending several minutes gathering information and planning their attacks before beginning weapons runs. Sarah took a different approach. She arrived over the target area and immediately began a high-speed, low-altitude reconnaissance pass that allowed her to visually identify all threat positions and friendly locations in less than 2 minutes. She then executed a series of gun runs that systematically eliminated each threat position with minimal ammunition expenditure and perfect accuracy. What impressed the instructors most wasn't just the precision of her weapons delivery, but the tactical thinking behind her approach. Instead of attacking the most obvious targets first, she had prioritized threats based on their immediate danger to friendly forces. She had also positioned her attack runs to use terrain features for protection and to avoid overflying friendly positions. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes from arrival to completion, compared to the 2030 minutes typically required by other students. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson pulled Sarah aside after that flight for a private conversation. In 15 years of instructing A-10 pilots, he told her, I've never seen a student demonstrate that level of tactical thinking and situational awareness. You have an intuitive understanding of close air support that usually takes years of combat experience to develop. As A-10 training neared completion, Sarah's reputation had spread throughout the squadron. She was known not just as an exceptional pilot, but as someone who truly understood the close air support mission at a fundamental level. Her technical skills were flawless, her tactical thinking was sophisticated, and her dedication to the mission was absolute. The final phase of training involved integrated exercises with actual ground units, where A-10 students would provide close air support to Army and Marine units conducting training exercises. This was the closest thing to real combat that training could provide, and it was where many students discovered whether they truly had what it took to be close air support pilots. Sarah's performance during these exercises was nothing short of remarkable. She developed immediate rapport with ground controllers, who quickly learned that they could count on her for precise, timely fire support. She had an ability to understand what ground units needed, even when they couldn't articulate it clearly, and she consistently delivered effects that exceeded expectations. One Army captain who worked with Sarah during a particularly challenging exercise would later write in her evaluation, Captain Mitchell demonstrated the highest level of professionalism and competence I have encountered in close air support operations. Her ability to assess tactical situations and deliver precise fires while maintaining constant situational awareness was extraordinary. The soldiers on the ground knew they could count on her, and that confidence translated into increased effectiveness for the entire unit. When graduation day arrived, Sarah finished at the top of her A-10 training class in every measurable category. Her technical scores were perfect, her flight evaluations were outstanding, and her tactical assessments were the highest anyone could remember. But more importantly, she had earned the respect of instructors and classmates who recognized that she possessed something that couldn't be taught, a natural understanding of what it meant to be a guardian angel for soldiers on the ground. The celebration was tempered by the knowledge that graduation meant assignment to a combat squadron, and almost certain deployment to Afghanistan, where A-10 units were providing critical close air support to coalition forces engaged in counterinsurgency operations. The war was escalating, and experienced close air support pilots were in high demand to support ground operations in some of the most dangerous areas of the country. Sarah received orders to the 354th Fighter Squadron, based at Davis-Monthan but scheduled for deployment to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan within 6 months. She would be joining a unit with a distinguished combat record and a reputation for aggressive, effective close air support operations. It was exactly the assignment she had hoped for, even though she knew it would test everything she had learned and push her abilities to their absolute limits. As she packed her belongings and prepared for the transition to operational status, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from crop dusting over Kansas wheat fields to preparing for combat operations in Afghanistan. She had proven herself in every phase of training, but she knew that real combat would be different from anything she had experienced. The decisions she made in the cockpit would have life and death consequences for real soldiers in real danger, and there would be no instructors to guide her and no opportunity for second chances. But she was ready. The girl who had learned to fly in an old crop duster had become Captain Sarah Mitchell, A-10 pilot, and she was about to take the next step toward becoming Storm. The soldiers of Afghanistan were about to gain a guardian angel who would prove that sometimes the most unexpected warrior can become the most formidable force on the battlefield. Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan looked like something from another planet when Sarah first stepped off the transport aircraft in March 2011. The massive base sprawled across the desert landscape, a sprawling collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and aircraft parking areas that hummed with constant activity. The smell of jet fuel, dust, and diesel exhaust hung in the air, mixing with the thin oxygen of the high-altitude location to create an atmosphere that was uniquely military and unmistakably foreign. Sarah's first view of her new home was the flight line, where rows of A-10 Thunderbolt I's sat baking in the Afghan sun. These weren't the pristine training aircraft she had flown at Davis-Monthan. These were combat veterans, their grey paint faded and chipped, their surfaces bearing the scars of hundreds of combat missions. Some showed obvious signs of battle damage that had been repaired, with patches of newer metal covering holes that told stories of close encounters with enemy fire. The 354th Fighter Squadron, known as the Bulldogs, had been flying combat missions from Bagram for 8 months when Sarah arrived. The unit had established a reputation for aggressive, effective close air support that had earned the respect of ground units throughout Regional Command East. But 8 months of high-tempo combat operations had taken their toll on both aircraft and aircrew, and the squadron was grateful for the arrival of fresh pilots to help shoulder the demanding mission load. Sarah's squadron commander was Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk Morrison, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who had flown over 400 combat missions in the A-10. Morrison had earned his reputation as one of the most effective close air support pilots in the Air Force, and he ran his squadron with a combination of professionalism, tactical expertise, and genuine concern for his pilots that inspired fierce loyalty. "Welcome to the real Air Force," Morrison told Sarah during her first squadron briefing. "Everything you learned in training was preparation for this. Here, every mission matters, every decision has consequences, and the soldiers on the ground are counting on you to be perfect. We're going to ease you into operations gradually, but I want you to understand that there's no such thing as a routine mission in Afghanistan." Sarah's first week at Bagram was spent in intensive mission briefings, intelligence updates, and theater-specific training designed to prepare her for the unique challenges of operating in Afghanistan. The country's terrain was unlike anything she had encountered during training, with towering mountains, narrow valleys, and unpredictable weather patterns that could change from clear skies to zero visibility in a matter of minutes. The enemy situation was complex and constantly evolving. Taliban and other insurgent forces had adapted their tactics to account for coalition air power, using a combination of concealment, mobility, and human shields to minimize their vulnerability to air attack. They operated from positions in civilian areas, moved constantly to avoid detection, and had developed sophisticated techniques for engaging coalition forces while minimizing their exposure to airstrikes. Perhaps most challenging of all were the rules of engagement, which required A-10 pilots to positively identify targets and ensure that their attacks would not cause unacceptable collateral damage. In a counterinsurgency environment where the enemy deliberately operated among civilians, this meant that pilots had to make split-second decisions about weapons employment while considering complex factors like civilian proximity, building construction, and potential secondary effects. Sarah's first combat mission came on a quiet Tuesday morning, flying as wingman to Major Pete "Tank" Williams, an experienced pilot who had been flying combat missions from Bagram since the beginning of the deployment. The mission was supposed to be a routine armed reconnaissance flight over a relatively quiet sector of Helmand Province, but Sarah quickly learned that there was no such thing as routine in Afghanistan. They had been airborne for less than 2 hours when they received an urgent call from a ground controller. "Hog 11, this is Paladin 6. We have troops in contact. Immediate close air support requested." The voice on the radio was calm but urgent, and Sarah could hear the unmistakable sound of gunfire in the background. Tank immediately turned toward the coordinates provided by the ground controller, and Sarah followed in close formation. As they approached the target area, she could see the tactical situation developing below. A coalition patrol had been ambushed while moving through a narrow valley, and enemy fighters were engaging them from concealed positions on the ridgelines above. Hog 11, Paladin 6 were taking heavy fire from multiple positions on the north ridge. "We have wounded and need immediate fires to break contact," the ground controller reported. Sarah could hear the stress in his voice now, and the background noise of gunfire was getting louder. Tank began his attack run immediately, diving toward the ridgeline while Sarah maintained altitude and provided overwatch. She watched as Tank's GAU-8 cannon stitched a line of destruction across the enemy positions, the distinctive sound of the massive gun audible even over her engine noise. The effect was immediate. The enemy fire slackened as the insurgents sought cover from the devastating 30 rounds. But Tank's attack had revealed additional enemy positions that hadn't been visible from altitude. "Hog 12, I've got muzzle flashes from the south ridge as well. Looks like they've got us in a crossfire," Tank called over the radio. Sarah looked down at the valley floor and could see the coalition patrol pinned down in a small depression, unable to move in any direction without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The soldiers were depending on air support to suppress the enemy positions so they could either attack or withdraw, and Sarah realized that she was about to experience the reality of close air support for the first time. "Tank, I can take the south ridge while you continue working the north," Sarah radioed. Without waiting for a response, she rolled into a steep dive toward the enemy positions she had identified. The ridgeline rushed up toward her as she refined her aim point and prepared to engage with the GAU-8. The moment she pulled the trigger, Sarah felt the massive cannon's recoil shake the entire aircraft. The gun's rate of fire was so high that individual shots blended into a continuous buzzing roar that seemed to come from the aircraft's soul. She watched her rounds impact the rocky ridgeline in a shower of sparks and debris, and she could see enemy fighters scrambling for cover as the depleted uranium shells chewed through their positions. She pulled out of her dive and climbed back to altitude, already planning her next attack run. Below, she could see that the enemy fire from the south ridge had stopped completely, and the coalition patrol was beginning to move toward better defensive positions. But Tank was still working the north ridge, where stubborn enemy fighters continued to engage despite the devastating fire from above. For the next 40 minutes, Sarah and Tank worked methodically to eliminate enemy positions throughout the valley. They coordinated their attacks to maintain constant pressure on the insurgents, while avoiding any possibility of friendly fire incidents. Sarah found herself thinking 3 steps ahead, anticipating where enemy fighters might move next, and positioning herself to engage them when they revealed their positions. The engagement finally ended when the last enemy fighter abandoned his position and fled into the mountains. The coalition patrol was able to extract their wounded and withdraw from the valley without further casualties. As Sarah and Tank headed back toward Bagram, the ground controller's final radio call stayed with her. "Hawk Flight, Paladin 6. Outstanding work today. You saved our lives down there." Back at Bagram, Sarah went through the post-mission procedures that would become routine over the coming months. Intelligence debrief, maintenance inspection of the aircraft, and a detailed discussion of the mission with her flight lead and squadron leadership. But what stayed with her most was the realization that the training scenarios, no matter how realistic, couldn't fully prepare her for the emotional impact of knowing that real soldiers had been depending on her performance. Major Williams pulled her aside after the debrief. "You did good work out there," he told her. "Your attack runs were precise, your target identification was solid, and you kept your head in a chaotic situation. That's about as good as a first combat mission gets." But Sarah knew that this had been a relatively simple engagement compared to what other pilots in the squadron had faced. Over the next few weeks, she would learn about missions where A-10 pilots had to engage targets in dense urban areas, where the margin for error was measured in feet rather than yards. She would hear stories of pilots who had to make split-second decisions about whether to engage targets when civilians were present, and she would come to understand the enormous responsibility that came with flying close air support in a counterinsurgency environment. Her second combat mission came 3 days later, and this time she was flying as flight lead with a newer pilot as her wingman. The mission was a deliberate strike against a confirmed enemy compound that intelligence had identified as a Taliban command post. Sarah spent hours studying satellite imagery of the target area, planning attack routes that would minimize exposure to enemy fire and potential collateral damage. The strike went flawlessly. Sarah's first attack run destroyed the main building with a precision-guided bomb, while her wingman eliminated a secondary structure with GAU-8 fire. Post-mission intelligence confirmed that they had eliminated a significant enemy leadership cell and disrupted Taliban operations throughout the region. More importantly, they had accomplished the mission without any civilian casualties or friendly fire incidents. Word of Sarah's performance began to spread throughout the squadron and beyond. Other pilots noticed her unusual combination of aggressive tactics and precise execution. Ground controllers began specifically requesting her by call sign when they needed close air support in challenging situations. Squadron leadership started assigning her to the most demanding missions, knowing that she could be counted on to deliver results. It was during her 3rd week of combat operations that Sarah earned her call sign. The mission was a complex, close air support operation in support of a special operations raid against a high-value target. The special operators needed immediate air cover while they secured the objective, and the situation on the ground was extremely fluid. Sarah and her wingman arrived over the target area just as the ground assault was beginning. Almost immediately, they began receiving multiple requests for fires as the special operators encountered heavier resistance than expected. Enemy fighters were engaging from concealed positions throughout the compound, and the ground force commander needed immediate, precise fires to support his troops. For the next 2 hours, Sarah flew mission after mission over the target area, engaging enemy positions with a combination of cannon fire and precision-guided weapons. She had to operate in close proximity to friendly forces, often engaging targets that were less than 100 meters from coalition troops. The demands on her flying skills and tactical judgment were enormous, requiring split-second decisions about weapons employment while maintaining perfect situational awareness. What distinguished her performance was not just her accuracy or her tactical skills, but her ability to anticipate what the ground forces needed before they asked for it. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how the battle was developing, and would position herself to engage threats before they became critical. Ground controllers began to rely on her tactical judgment as much as her weapons delivery capabilities. The mission climax came when enemy reinforcements attempted to counterattack the Special Operations position. Sarah identified the threat before the ground forces were aware of it and engaged the enemy column with devastating effect. Her attack runs were so precise and so effective that the enemy counterattack was broken before it could develop into a serious threat. When the special operators finally extracted from the objective, their ground force commander made an unusual radio call. Hawg 11, Paladin 6. I've been doing this for 12 years and I've never seen close air support like that. You were like a storm over the battlefield, destroying everything that threatened us. Outstanding work, Storm. The call sign stuck immediately. Within days, everyone in the squadron was calling her Storm, and the name spread to other units throughout Bagram. Sarah had found her identity as a combat pilot, and the name captured something essential about her approach to close air support. When she arrived over a battlefield, enemy fighters learned to take cover because Storm was coming, and she brought destruction to anyone who threatened coalition forces. Over the following months, Storm's reputation grew throughout Regional Command East. Ground units began specifically requesting her for their most challenging missions. Other A-10 pilots studied her techniques and tried to understand what made her so effective. Squadron leadership recognized that they had an exceptional pilot on their hands, someone whose skills and judgment exceeded anything they had seen before. But Storm herself remained focused on the mission. Every combat sortie was another opportunity to save coalition lives and disrupt enemy operations. She continued to study enemy tactics, refine her own techniques, and push herself to new levels of performance. She was building towards something extraordinary, though she didn't know it yet. The mission that would make her a legend was still ahead, and it would test everything she had learned about combat aviation and push her abilities to their absolute limits. October 15, 2011, began like any other day at Bagram Airfield. Storm was scheduled for what appeared to be a routine combat air patrol over the volatile Kunar province, an area known for its rugged terrain and persistent Taliban activity. She had flown dozens of similar missions over the past 6 months, providing air cover for coalition operations and responding to troops in contact situations as they developed. What nobody knew that morning was that this mission would become the stuff of military legend, a demonstration of close air support so extraordinary that it would be studied in military academies for decades to come. The day would test every skill Storm had developed, push her aircraft to its absolute limits, and ultimately earn her the respect of the most elite warriors in the United States military. Storm's aircraft that day was tail number 7, 80691. An A-10 she had flown numerous times before and had complete confidence in. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had spent extra time that morning ensuring every system was perfect. "She's ready to go hunting, Captain," he told Storm as she completed her pre-flight inspection. Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would prove to be. The mission briefing had been routine. Intelligence reported normal levels of enemy activity in Kunar province, with several known Taliban operating areas that required surveillance. Storm would be flying alone, which was unusual but not unprecedented when pilot availability was limited. Her call sign that day was Hawg 25, and she was equipped with a full load of 30mm ammunition for the GAU, 8 cannon plus 4 AGM. 6.5 Maverick missiles for precision strikes against hardened targets. Storm took off from Bagram at 0630 hours local time, climbing into the clear morning sky above the Hindu Kush Mountains. The flight to her assigned patrol area took 45 minutes, giving her time to review the intelligence updates and familiarize herself with the terrain she would be operating over. Kunar province was notorious for its maze of valleys and ridgelines that provided perfect concealment for enemy forces and made air-to-ground operations extremely challenging. She had been on station for less than 30 minutes when the first call came in. Hawg 25, this is Outlaw 6, we have troops in contact, immediate close air support requested. The voice belonged to Captain Mike Foster, commanding a platoon of 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment that had been conducting a patrol in the Petch River Valley. Storm immediately turned toward the coordinates provided by Outlaw 6, pushing her A-10 to maximum speed. As she approached the area, she could see the tactical situation developing below. The infantry platoon had been moving through a narrow valley when they were ambushed by enemy forces positioned on the surrounding ridgelines. The soldiers were pinned down in an open area with minimal cover, taking fire from multiple directions. Outlaw 6, Hawg 25 is on station. I can see your position, and I'm identifying enemy firing positions now. Storm radioed, as she began her initial assessment of the battlefield. What she saw was not encouraging. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, positioning themselves on commanding terrain that gave them clear fields of fire while providing excellent concealment. Storm began her attack runs immediately, targeting the most threatening enemy positions with precise bursts from her A-10 cannon. The effect was immediate. Enemy fire slackened as the insurgents sought cover from the devastating 30mm rounds. But Storm quickly realized that this was not a typical Taliban ambush. The enemy fighters were well-trained, disciplined, and equipped with sophisticated weapons including RPGs and heavy machine guns. Hog 25, Outlaw 6 were taking effective fire from multiple positions. I count at least 20 enemy fighters on the ridgelines, and they've got us completely surrounded, Captain Foster reported. Storm could hear the tension in his voice, and the background noise of gunfire was constant and intense. Over the next hour, Storm flew mission after mission over the trapped infantry platoon, systematically engaging enemy positions with cannon fire and precision-guided weapons. But every time she suppressed one position, enemy fighters would appear in new locations, maintaining constant pressure on the coalition forces below. It became clear that this was not a typical Taliban unit, but a well-organized force with sophisticated tactics and leadership. The situation became critical when Outlaw 6 reported that they had multiple wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical evacuation. But the enemy fire was too intense to allow a medical helicopter to land, and the platoon's position was too exposed for them to move to a safer location. Storm realized that she was the only thing standing between the trapped soldiers and disaster. Outlaw 6, Storm is going to keep the bad guys' heads down while you move to that ridgeline to the east. I can provide continuous fires to cover your movement, Storm radioed. What she was proposing was extraordinarily dangerous. She would have to fly repeated attack runs at low altitude, making herself vulnerable to enemy fire in order to suppress the insurgent positions long enough for the infantry to move. What followed was one of the most intense close air support engagements in the history of military aviation. For the next 2 hours, Storm flew continuous attack runs over the enemy positions, never allowing the insurgents to maintain effective fire on the moving infantry platoon. She would dive toward one enemy position, engage it with cannon fire, then immediately transition to another attack run against a different position. The enemy fighters quickly realized what Storm was trying to do and began concentrating their fire on her aircraft. Several times she felt the impact of small arms fire against her A-10's armored hull, but the aircraft's legendary durability allowed her to continue flying and fighting. She could see tracer rounds arcing past her cockpit and hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her aircraft. During one particularly intense attack run, an enemy RPG round exploded close enough to her aircraft to fill the cockpit with the smell of cordite and cause multiple warning lights to illuminate on her instrument panel. But Storm continued her attack, placing her cannon rounds precisely on the enemy position, before climbing away to assess her aircraft's condition. Hog 25, you're trailing smoke, Captain Foster called from the ground. Storm checked her instruments and confirmed that she had hydraulic system damage, but all flight controls were still responding normally. She made the decision to continue the mission rather than return to base, knowing that the infantry platoon was still in desperate need of air support. As the engagement continued, Storm began to run low on ammunition for her A-10 cannon. She had already expended her 4 Maverick missiles against hardened enemy positions, and she estimated that she had less than 200 rounds of 30mm ammunition remaining. In normal circumstances, this would be the time to return to base for rearming, but the infantry platoon was still under heavy fire, and no other close air support was available. It was at this moment that Storm made a decision that would become part of military legend. Rather than conserving her remaining ammunition and waiting for additional air support, she chose to continue engaging enemy positions with short, precise bursts that maximized the psychological effect of her cannon fire while conserving rounds for the most critical targets. The tactic worked brilliantly. Storm had developed such an intimate understanding of the battlefield that she could predict where enemy fighters would move next, positioning herself to engage them the moment they revealed their positions. Her cannon fire was so accurate that she could suppress individual fighting positions with just a few rounds, making her limited ammunition last far longer than should have been possible. But the most extraordinary moment came when Storm realized that she could use her aircraft itself as a weapon. When enemy fighters in a particularly stubborn position refused to be suppressed by cannon fire, Storm began making low-altitude passes directly over their position, using the psychological effect of a 30,000-pound aircraft flying at high speed just feet above their heads to force them into cover. The tactic was incredibly dangerous, requiring Storm to fly straight and level at extremely low altitude while exposed to concentrated enemy fire. But it was devastatingly effective. Enemy fighters would immediately seek cover whenever they heard the distinctive sound of her twin engines approaching, giving the infantry platoon precious seconds of relief from hostile fire. During one of these low passes, Storm's aircraft took a direct hit from a heavy machine gun that punched holes through her left wing and damaged her left engine. The aircraft lurched violently to one side, and Storm had to fight to maintain control as multiple warning systems activated simultaneously. For a moment, it appeared that she might lose the aircraft entirely, but Storm's thousands of hours of flying experience and her intimate knowledge of the A-10's capabilities allowed her to regain control and assess the damage. She had lost significant power from the left engine and had hydraulic fluid streaming from holes in the wing, but the aircraft was still flyable. More importantly, she still had ammunition remaining, and the infantry platoon still needed her support. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Rather than withdrawing to a safe distance to assess her battle damage, Storm continued flying attack runs against enemy positions. She compensated for her damaged aircraft by adjusting her attack profiles and flying even more precisely than before. Her cannon fire remained devastatingly accurate despite the aircraft's degraded performance. The enemy fighters, who had been expecting the damaged A-10 to withdraw from the battle, were shocked to see Storm continue her attacks with the same intensity as before. The psychological effect was enormous. They began to abandon their positions and flee into the mountains, unwilling to continue fighting against an opponent who seemed unstoppable. Finally, after more than 4 hours of continuous combat, the last enemy fighters abandoned their positions and retreated. Captain Foster's platoon was able to establish a secure landing zone for medical evacuation of their wounded, and the trapped soldiers were finally safe. Storm had single-handedly turned a potential disaster into a tactical victory. As Storm turned her battle-damaged A-10 toward Bagram Airfield, she received a radio call that she would never forget. Hog 25, this is Outlaw 6. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. You saved every life in my platoon, and we'll never forget it. You are one hell of a pilot. But the most extraordinary radio call came from an unexpected source. Hog 25, this is Neptune 6. Storm recognized the call sign as belonging to a Navy SEAL team that had been operating in a nearby area and had monitored her engagement over the radio. Ma'am, this is Commander Jake Sullivan. My team and I have been listening to your fight for the past 4 hours, and we wanted you to know that what you did today was the most extraordinary display of airmanship and courage we've ever witnessed. You fought like a force of nature, and those soldiers owe their lives to your skill and determination. The SEAL commander's words carried special weight because Navy SEALs were known for their extremely high standards and reluctant praise. For a SEAL team leader to publicly acknowledge an Air Force pilot's performance was almost unprecedented, and Storm knew that word of this endorsement would spread throughout the Special Operations community. Landing her damaged A-10 at Bagram required all of Storm's flying skills. The aircraft was barely controllable, with significant battle damage affecting multiple systems. But she managed to get the aircraft on the ground safely, where her crew chief and maintenance team immediately began assessing the extent of the damage. What they found was sobering. Storm's A-10 had taken over 200 hits from small arms fire, with major damage to the left engine, hydraulic system, and flight controls. Several critical components had been damaged or destroyed, and it was miraculous that the aircraft had remained flyable. In the opinion of the maintenance team, any other aircraft would have been shot down hours earlier. But Storm had brought her aircraft home, and more importantly, she had saved the lives of an entire infantry platoon through her extraordinary skill, courage, and determination. Word of her performance spread throughout Bagram, Airfield, and beyond, establishing her reputation as one of the most capable combat pilots in the theater of operations. The mission report that was filed that day would become required reading D at the Air Force Weapons School, and Storm's tactics would be studied and emulated by close air support pilots for years to come. She had demonstrated what was possible when exceptional flying skills were combined with tactical brilliance and unshakable courage under fire. But for Storm herself, the mission was simply another day at work. When asked about her performance by squadron leadership, she simply said, "The soldiers needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That's what we're here for." That understated response was typical of Storm's personality, but it couldn't hide the fact that she had just proven herself to be one of the most extraordinary combat pilots of her generation. The legend of Storm was spreading throughout the military, and even the most elite special operations units were taking notice of the young A-10 pilot who fought like a force of nature. 3 weeks after her legendary engagement in Kunar Province, Storm was preparing for what should have been a routine escort mission when her life intersected with the most elite warriors in the American military in a way that would create a story told in special operations communities around the world. The mission briefing at 0500 hours on November 7, 2011 seemed straightforward. Provide air cover for a Navy SEAL team conducting a high-value target raid in the Spin Boldak district near the Pakistan border. The SEAL team was DEVGRU, more commonly known as SEAL Team 6, the same unit that had eliminated Osama bin Laden just 6 months earlier. Their target was a Taliban commander who had been orchestrating attacks against coalition forces throughout southern Afghanistan. The operation, codenamed Neptune Fury, was planned as a quick insertion, target elimination, and extraction that should take no more than 2 hours from start to finish. Storm's mission was to provide overwatch during the operation, maintaining a presence over the target area to respond to any enemy reinforcements or unexpected threats. It was the kind of mission she had flown dozens of times before, and she expected to spend most of her time orbiting at altitude while the SEALs did their work on the ground. Sullivan had specifically requested Storm for this mission, telling his air liaison officer that he wanted that Storm pilot who saved the infantry platoon, providing their air cover. Word of Storm's extraordinary performance had spread throughout the special operations community, and Sullivan wanted to work with someone he knew he could count on. Storm took off from Kandahar Airfield at 0600 hours in her usual A-10, tail number 788-0691, which had been fully repaired after the battle damage from Kunar Province. Her crew chief had installed a small lightning bolt decal near the cockpit, a tribute to her Storm call sign that had become her aircraft's unofficial insignia. She was carrying a full load of 30 mm ammunition and 4 precision-guided bombs, standard armament for a mission that wasn't expected to require heavy fires. The flight to the target area took 90 minutes, giving Storm time to study the intelligence updates and coordinate with the SEAL team's communication frequencies. The target was a compound in a remote valley that intelligence had identified as the Taliban commander's headquarters. Surveillance had confirmed that the compound was lightly defended, with no more than a dozen fighters expected to be present. Storm arrived over the target area, just as the SEAL insertion helicopter was approaching. From her position at 15,000 feet, she could see the compound clearly through her targeting systems. It looked exactly as the intelligence briefing had described. A typical Afghan compound with high walls, several buildings, and minimal defensive positions. Everything appeared normal for what should be a straightforward raid. Storm, Neptune 6, we're 2 minutes out from insertion, Commander Sullivan radioed. Looks quiet down there. Hope we can get in and out without needing your services. Neptune 6, Storm copies. I'll be keeping an eye on things from up here. Let me know if you need anything, Storm replied. She settled into a holding pattern above the compound, monitoring the radio frequencies and watching for any signs of enemy activity in the surrounding area. The SEAL insertion went perfectly. The helicopter dropped the 8-man team at a landing zone 800 meters from the compound, and they immediately began their approach to the target. Storm watched through her targeting pod as the dark figures moved across the landscape with the fluid precision that made Special Operations Forces so effective. The SEALs breached the compound walls and began clearing the buildings methodically. For the first 30 minutes, everything went according to plan. They encountered minimal resistance and were making steady progress towards securing their target. Storm remained at altitude, occasionally checking in but mostly just maintaining her presence over the area. Then, everything went wrong at once. Storm, Neptune 6, we've got a problem. Sullivan's voice crackled over the radio with an urgency that immediately got Storm's attention. We've got enemy reinforcements approaching from multiple directions. Looks like this was a setup. Storm immediately began scanning the area around the compound with her sensors and quickly confirmed Sullivan's assessment. Enemy fighters were approaching the compound from 3 different directions, moving in organized groups that suggested this was a planned ambush rather than a spontaneous response. Intelligence estimates had been completely wrong. Instead of a dozen fighters, the SEALs were about to face more than 100 enemy combatants. Neptune 6, Storm has eyes on enemy forces approaching from the north, east, and south. I count approximately 30 fighters from each direction, all moving toward your position, Storm reported as she began planning her response. Storm, we need immediate close air support. We're going to be completely surrounded in about 10 minutes, Sullivan replied. The professionalism in his voice was absolute, but Storm could hear the underlying tension of a commander who realized his team was walking into a trap. Storm immediately dove toward the approaching enemy forces, selecting the northern group as her first target. These fighters were moving in vehicles along a dirt road that would bring them to the compound in less than 10 minutes. If they reached the compound before the SEALs could extract, the Special Operations Team would be trapped and outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. Her first attack run was devastating. Storm's GAU. 8 cannon destroyed 2 vehicles and scattered the enemy fighters, forcing them to abandon their vehicles and seek cover among the rocks and trees alongside the road. But even as she pulled out of her dive, she could see that the other 2 groups were continuing their advance toward the compound. Neptune 6, I've disrupted the northern group, but the eastern and southern forces are still approaching. You've got about 8 minutes before they reach the compound, Storm radioed as she turned toward the eastern group. Storm, we need more time. The target is not at this location, and we need to search additional buildings before we can extract, Sullivan replied. The SEALs had discovered that their primary target was not in the compound, but intelligence suggested he might be hiding in one of the outbuildings that they hadn't searched yet. Storm realized that she was facing an impossible tactical problem. She had 3 separate enemy forces converging on the SEAL position, with more than 100 enemy fighters total. Even with her formidable firepower, she couldn't be in 3 places at once, and she didn't have enough ammunition to eliminate all of the approaching threats. But Storm had learned something during her months of combat operations in Afghanistan. Sometimes, the most effective weapon was not firepower, but psychology. The Taliban fighters approaching the compound had probably never faced sustained attack from an A-10, and they might not understand what they were up against. Storm began flying what she would later describe as the most intense series of attack runs of her career. Instead of trying to destroy all of the enemy forces, she focused on creating maximum psychological impact by attacking each group in rapid succession. She would dive toward one group, engage them with cannon fire, then immediately transition to attack another group, before they could organize an effective response. The tactic worked brilliantly. The enemy fighters had never experienced anything like the sustained, precise attacks that Storm was delivering. Every time they tried to organize an advance toward the compound, Storm would appear overhead and force them back into defensive positions. She was essentially holding 3 separate enemy forces at bay through sheer aggression and tactical skill. Storm, this is incredible, Sullivan radioed during a brief lull in the action. You're single-handedly stopping 3 companies of enemy fighters. I've never seen anything like it. But Storm knew that she couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely. She was already running low on ammunition, and the enemy forces were beginning to adapt to her tactics. Some of the fighters had begun moving in smaller groups that were harder to detect and engage, and they were slowly but steadily advancing toward the compound, despite her best efforts. Neptune 6, Storm is getting low on ammo and fuel. What's your timeline for extraction? Storm asked as she began another attack run against the southern group. Storm, we need at least another 30 minutes. We think we've located the target in one of the outbuildings, but we need time to properly search and secure the area, Sullivan replied. Storm quickly calculated her fuel and ammunition status. She had enough fuel to remain on station for another 45 minutes, but at her current rate of expenditure, she would run out of ammunition in less than 20 minutes. She was facing a situation where the SEALs needed more time than her weapons could provide. That's when Storm made a decision that would become legendary in special operations circles. Instead of conserving her remaining ammunition, she chose to use every round she had to buy the SEALs as much time as possible. She would fight until she literally had no ammunition left, and then she would figure out what to do next. For the next 20 minutes, Storm flew the most intensive series of attack runs of her career. She engaged every enemy position she could identify, switching between targets so rapidly that the enemy forces couldn't organize any coordinated advance toward the compound. Her cannon fire was so precise and so devastating that entire groups of enemy fighters abandoned their positions and fled, rather than face continued attack from above. But finally, inevitably, Storm's ammunition ran out. She fired her last burst of 30mm rounds at an enemy machine gun position and realized that she was now orbiting above a battlefield with no weapons except the aircraft itself. Neptune 6, Storm is Winchester, she radioed, using the military term for being out of ammunition. I can still provide overwatch, but I don't have anything left to shoot. Sullivan's response was immediate and unexpected. Storm, this is Neptune 6. What you've done today is beyond anything we could have hoped for. You've single-handedly held off 3 enemy companies and given us the time we needed to complete the mission. We've secured the target and we're ready for extraction. But as the SEALs began their movement toward the extraction landing zone, the enemy forces that Storm had been suppressing began to reorganize. Without the threat of her cannon fire, they started advancing toward the compound again, and it became clear that they might intercept the SEALs before they could reach the extraction point. Storm made a decision that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Even though she was out of ammunition, she began flying low-level passes over the enemy positions, using the psychological effect of her aircraft to continue suppressing the enemy forces. The sound of her twin engines at full power, combined with the memory of the devastating cannon fire she had delivered earlier, was enough to keep many of the enemy fighters in defensive positions. But some of the more determined enemy fighters began advancing despite her presence overhead. Storm realized that she needed to do something more dramatic to stop their advance. That's when she made the decision that would earn her a place in military legend. Storm dove toward the largest concentration of advancing enemy fighters and began flying what can only be described as attack runs with an unarmed aircraft. She would dive toward enemy positions at high speed and pull out at the last possible second, creating sonic booms and forcing the enemy fighters to take cover. The psychological effect was enormous. Fighters who had been advancing steadily suddenly found themselves cowering in whatever shelter they could find. During one of these passes, Storm flew so low over an enemy position that her landing gear nearly touched the trees. Enemy fighters scattered in all directions, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their panic to escape what they thought was an imminent crash. The tactic was incredibly dangerous, but it was devastatingly effective at disrupting enemy operations. Commander Sullivan, watching this extraordinary display from the ground, made a radio call that would become part of military folklore. Storm, Neptune 6. Ma'am, I've been in special operations for 15 years, and I've worked with the best pilots in every service. What you're doing right now is the most extraordinary display of courage and skill I've ever witnessed. I surrender. You're better at this than we are. The radio call was heard by every member of the SEAL team, and word of it spread throughout the Special Operations community within hours. A Navy SEAL commander, one of the most elite warriors in the American military, had just publicly acknowledged that an Air Force pilot was performing at a level that exceeded even their own standards. Storm continued her unarmed attack runs until the SEAL extraction helicopter arrived. She provided overwatch as the team boarded and then escorted them safely out of the area. Only when the SEALs were completely clear of enemy territory did she turn toward base, having completed one of the most extraordinary missions in the history of close air support. When Storm landed at Kandahar Airfield, she found Commander Sullivan waiting for her on the flight line. The SEAL team leader approached her aircraft as she climbed out of the cockpit, and what he said next would be repeated throughout the military for years to come. "Captain Mitchell," Sullivan said, "I fought alongside the best warriors this country has to offer, and I want you to know that you're one of us now. What you did today went beyond duty, beyond courage, beyond anything we had a right to expect. You didn't just provide close air support. You became part of our team, and you fought like one of us." Sullivan then did something unprecedented. He removed his SEAL Trident pin from his uniform and handed it to Storm. This belongs to warriors who understand that mission accomplishment and the lives of their teammates are more important than their own safety. You've earned the right to wear it. The gesture was extraordinary. SEAL Trident pins are sacred to members of the Special Operations community, and they are never given to outsiders. But Sullivan recognized that Storm had demonstrated the same warrior ethos, tactical skill, and unflinching courage that defined the SEAL community. Word of Sullivan's gesture spread throughout the military almost immediately. Storm had not only earned the respect of the Special Operations community, she had been officially acknowledged as one of them. The young woman who had started her aviation career crop dusting over Kansas wheat fields had become a legend among the most elite warriors in the American military. Storm's performance that day would be studied at military academies and special operations schools for decades to come. She had demonstrated that close air support could be more than just providing firepower. It could be about becoming an integral part of the ground team and fighting with the same dedication and tactical brilliance that characterize special operations forces themselves. But for Storm, the mission was simply another example of doing whatever was necessary to accomplish the mission and protect American forces. When asked about Sullivan's tribute, she simply said, "Those SEALs needed support, and I was in a position to provide it. That's what we do." That understated response was typical of Storm's character, but it couldn't hide the fact that she had achieved something unprecedented in military aviation. She had earned the complete respect of the Special Operations community and had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary warrior can emerge from the most unexpected place. The girl who had learned to fly in a crop duster over Kansas farmland had become Storm, a legend whose name would be spoken with reverence in military circles for generations to come. She had proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any obstacle, and she had shown that the warrior spirit knows no boundaries of gender, background, or expectation. The SEAL commander had surrendered, acknowledging that he was in the presence of a warrior whose abilities transcended traditional boundaries. Storm had turned her A-10 into more than just an aircraft. She had made it an extension of her will, a Tempest that could appear anywhere on the battlefield to provide salvation to those who needed it most. Her legend was complete, but her service continued. There would be more missions, more challenges, and more opportunities to prove that when soldiers needed a guardian angel, Storm would answer the call, ready to turn the sky itself into a weapon in defense of those who counted on her protection.